Hello and welcome to the European Parliament in Strasbourg. On the programme this week, bringing the EU closer to its citizens. But do the citizens really want to talk? A new survey says not. Also, as Belgium unveils its plans for the presidency of the European Union to MEPs, how much difference can this small but intensely Europhile country make? And when members of the European Parliament return to Strasbourg after their summer break, plans will be underway to deliver Europe's new currency to member states. But is the EU really prepared? Well, that's what I hope my guests will answer. Let me introduce them. We have Lousewies van der Laan, who is a Dutch social liberal and spokesperson on the Budget Control Committee. We have also Jean-Maurice Dehousse, who is a Belgian MEP from the Socialist Party, also Vice President of the Socialist Group here at the European Parliament, and Glyn Ford, Labour's spokesman on industry and trade. Thank you, all of you, for joining me. Lousewies van der Laan, this week the European Commission published this survey, which was really astonishing in showing the level of ignorance and a lack of interest, perhaps most of all, among Europe's citizens in the institutions. I mean, one of the figures that springs to mind is that 62% of Europeans were positively uninterested in taking part in discussions on the EU. Are you surprised about that?
No, I'm not at all surprised, because it is something that we notice very often. Lastly, of course, when we went to the European elections, that in my country, and I think in Britain it was the same, 70% of Europeans never bothered to go and vote. So the lack of interest is there. However, I don't think it's the fault of the citizens of Europe. I think is actually the fault of governments who are pressing ahead with big European projects, integration, monetary union, enlargement, without getting people involved and without convincing them and explaining things to them. And I notice that the interest is there. Whenever I go to my constituents and I speak about Europe, the questions are there, the interest is there.
The survey says the interest isn't there, though.
I mean, maybe it's otherwise they wouldn't come to see me. So you do get a filter already.
You get 28% that are interested.
Probably.
I mean, I've got 3.5 million voters in my constituency. I can go to meetings when people are quite interested and enthusiastic. But I mean, that can be 10% of my constituents that are interested. It's getting to the 90%
exactly.
who switch off. So I think it's a broader problem, actually. I don't think it's about the EU. If you actually look at the British general election, turnout fell sharply. If you look around Western-style democracies, they've got the same problems in the United States, in Japan, across the EU. There's actually people switching off from traditional politics in an enormously large way. Now, clearly it affects Europe, maybe it affects Europe a little bit more. But I mean, it's the notion that it's a European Parliament problem or it's a British problem, I think is wrong. It's actually a problem of Western-style democracy.
Jean-Maurice Dehousse, do you think, I mean, it's interesting if you look at Belgium in this context, that Belgium, despite the fact that we have this image of the country as being quite Europhile and positive about what the institutions are doing, 73% of people polled in this survey in Belgium said they weren't interested in taking part in discussions in the EU. Is that, as Glyn Ford saying, a reflection of a general feeling about institutions and politicians, or about Europe, do you think?
Well, first of all, Belgium is not an exception in the world or even in Europe. But I would like to say, as a man who has dealt with political science before in university, political participation is much like good health. You miss it when you don't have it. But when you have it, you don't discuss very much about your health. And you don't want to discuss about political participation. And very few people do want to participate. Like Glyn Ford said, in America, you have barely half of the American voters, much less than half of the American people, who bother to vote either for or against the candidates in the presidency. Why should it be different here?
So you think that the more democratic the society, the more unlikely people are to want to take part in it?
Except when they are interested in something very special. Then they get very motivated. They can get very motivated, but on special subjects.
So Lousewies van der Laan, by that argument, do you think, in fact, you and others like you are fighting a losing battle and trying to interest people in issues like enlargement and the Nice Treaty, and perhaps you should concentrate on environment and employment, which is what people want to hear about?
I think we have a risk that if we don't actually try to involve people and explain what we're doing, then we're going to get a backlash. And at a certain point, we're going to have to vote on an issue like enlargement. And if that vote ends up being negative, that would be a disaster. And I think that if we don't start the communication process now, then in 3 or 4 or 5 years when the vote comes, it'll be too late.
What do you mean by the vote? You mean a referendum like we've had in Ireland?
No, the accession treaties have to be ratified. So if Slovenia wants to join, the actual accession treaty with Slovenia will have to be ratified by the national parliament. And so even if there's no referendum, it could be that at that point people are so fed up with not being involved in these major decision making that anti-enlargement or anti-European parties could actually stand to gain more votes. And that is a development which we've seen in Italy with Berlusconi, in Austria with Haider, and it's a development which I don't think we can simply accept. So we have to wage that battle and make sure that with those anti-European voices, the pro-European voices are also there.
I never said it was a losing battle. I said that this was as things are, most generally, for better or for worse. Now, the same poll that you mentioned states that, if my memory is right, roughly 60% of the European public takes its information out of television. How much do you have information in the media, especially in prime time? How much can you get about the Nice Treaty, about what happens, about whatever you want to discuss?
I mean, I'm not pessimistic. I do think that politicians have to realise we need to find new ways of presenting. We can't carry on with the old ways. They're clearly not working. We need to find new ways of being in contact and communicating. But there's a whole series of problems here. There's the fragmentation of the media. It used to be that, there were in Britain 3 TV channels. I mean, now increasingly you've got much larger numbers. You need to have a much more diverse sort of set of inputs to actually get to people. They opt out of the traditional processes.
But the media can't simply propagandize on behalf of governments. The institutions themselves have to sort of engage in some way, don't they?
Well, two things. Firstly, I fully agree that it's the job of the institutions and politicians. It's our job to go out and explain what we're doing and why it's important. But secondly, I think there is some responsibility on the media not to propagandize, but to actually raise the issues. Now, I don't know the media in detail throughout the whole of the EU, but I mean certainly a large number of those 41% of the people who in the United Kingdom actually knew nothing about Nice. I think partly that's because some of them were actually reading newspapers and watching programmes that didn't cover Nice at all. So you can have a different view, you can be for or against, you can say it's a waste of time, but I think there is a responsibility to actually report news, because increasingly the news programmes aren't news anymore.
Do you share Lousewies van der Laan's sense of urgency that if this doesn't happen, if this issue is not grappled with, the anti-European parties are going to gather more support and there'll be a backlash?
I certainly think if we don't grapple with this, then there is a danger there. And I think that danger is probably seen in the British general election, which was an enormous victory for my party. But underlying that, a whole series of very strange things in terms of participation, in terms of growth of the extreme right, growth of what I call fourth parties, a whole series of potential problems for for democracy in the future. All
We've
of which have
seen
to be
that in
addressed.
Belgium, haven't we, to a degree, in the rise of the Vlaamsblok?
Well, yes and no. For one thing, the Vlaamsblok happens in the northern part of Belgium, but strangely enough, does not happen in the southern part, in the Walloon region, which means that you have specific reasons. And the specific reasons is that the Vlaamsblok is also a very nationalistic Flemish party, which we don't have in the south. It's not forbidden, or people don't go and hide. They just don't feel in the same way. They don't feel in the same way in Scotland as in Wales or in England, for that matter.
Now, let's move on, because your country, Belgium, is taking over the presidency. In fact, at this Parliament during this session, is laying out some of its priorities to the European Parliament. To what degree do you think the presidency should sort of tackle the sort of issues that this survey, the Irish referendum, the Gothenburg summit to some degree as well, have raised the lack of connection between Europe's public and its institutions?
For one thing, although I have been a minister in charge of a European presidency at what time, at least on a small level, I was a minister for science policy at that time. I think the European Parliament debates too much about the summits and what the presidency does and does not, generally speaking. But the Belgian presidency comes not only after the Swedish presidency, but after the French presidency, and it is the presidency of a small country. And the first affirmation is that Europe is not a territory reserved for big nations, and that small nations can have a say and should have a say, because what is federal, although it is not widely understood, is the opposite of a complete uniformization. We don't want to be assimilated. Tiny as we are, we want to remain something.
And yet,
in Europe.
the Council of Ministers at the Nice summit have just agreed a treaty which, in the view of many, Lousewies van der Laan, actually sort of stamps that power structure, the power of the big countries on top of the small countries. I mean, do you think the Belgian presidency should do something to reverse that? Could they do something?
Well, I think that in a way, with the Laken European Council, which will be the end of the Belgian presidency, they will try to launch a debate on the future of Europe. What kind of Europe do we want? Do we want a division of power between the countries and Europe? Do we want to decentralize? All of these, how do we get more democracy, more transparency? I mean, those are really the fundamental questions, and they are on the agenda, and the presidency has already made it clear that that is going to be their key priority, and I think that's correct. I don't think that they're going to find a solution, because the ideas about Europe and how it should be are so incredibly diverse. Some countries have taken clear positions on it, some others are not able to. We see Britain, which is very ambivalent about Europe. We see Denmark, which is still, of course, very reluctant in many ways. So I think it'll be a difficult process, but I'm glad that it's the Belgians who are starting them, because they have a tradition of decentralization, they have a tradition of democracy, but they have a pro-European idealism which they bring to the debate, which will be refreshing.
Do you think it's going to be an uncomfortable 6 months for Tony Blair, Glyn Ford, given that these sort of issues like direct election of the President of the Commission, maybe a European tax, more powers for the European Parliament, those kind of issues may well be sort of pushed a little bit during this presidency? Certainly won't be very palatable in Britain, will they?
Well,